What's going on, everybody? Jarrett with Jarrett Rushing Fishing, back again with a new video today. And as you can see, I'm not on the water again, but instead today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to do an educational video today. Now, the thing about these educational videos is I do one or two of them a year just to kind of give you all a few pointers and a few tips. And my season will start this weekend. So whenever this video drops, the Saturday after this video drops is whenever my season starts. So I'm actually doing a little tackle rigging today and getting a few things together. Now, one thing that was requested of me back, I guess about a month and a half ago, a young man by the name of Owen, so big shout out to you, Owen, requested that I do a video on how to tune your reel. So that's what we're going to discuss today, is how to tune your reel appropriately. And then we'll get into some bait selection, especially based on water clarity, and then maybe a little bit on line selection based on water clarity. So y'all stay tuned. All right, everybody, today what we're going to do is we're going to teach you how to tune in your Lew's MS8 Tournament Series right-handed baitcaster reel. That's the one thing to remember about these reels. They can either be right or left-handed, and it's an important concept whenever you start fishing, especially if you are right-handed or prefer a right-handed reel. So mine is going to be right-handed. I'm going to discuss 4 attributes of a baitcaster reel and show you how I personally customize my settings on my reel. So first and foremost, what you need to know is what's called a spool release. This here is exactly what it does. It releases the spool so the bait can go down, better known as the button. On the Lew's MS8, you can see right here. Click it and the spool releases. Okay. The second thing you need to know is right here behind the reel handle, you have this little red dial, and I'll get in there really close so you can see it. And that little red dial is called a drag. A drag is a function of a reel to release line even when the spool itself is locked. So I'm going to crank my drag way down and show you exactly what I'm talking about. So right now I have not pushed the button. You can see my bait is still dangling there. When I pull the line, it releases. Now, if I tighten this thing up just a little bit, it takes a lot more force for that bait to release. Show you again, a lot more force for the bait to release. Okay, we'll discuss on how I like to set my drag here in just a little bit, but for the time being, we also have a few more things to discuss on this reel. The next thing is this little knob. Usually it's silver. This one here had a red tint to it. As you can see, this is an old reel. I do want to point out at this particular juncture that I am showcasing this on one of Brad's rods. This is a medium heavy 7'2" fast, and this is what I love to throw my spinner baits on because it has a good backbone on it, but a little bit of a soft tip. So whenever I set the hook, I actually have enough backbone to pull that spinner bait, but not so much backbone that I pull the spinner bait out of the fish's mouth. And it's one of Brad's spinner baits. Now, back to the attributes of the reel. So we're looking right here. This is called the braking system of your spool. That is the brakes. Now, the brakes itself, when tightened all the way up, whenever you hit your button on a spool, your spool will not release. Line is not coming out even though the button has been pushed. So we start backing that off, and you can see that the line is unspooling. This is important because whenever you're a beginner, whenever you first start fishing, you need to make sure that your spool does exactly what mine did there. You can see I have the spinnerbait dangling. I take the reel and I push the button. The line releases extra slow, and I have no overspool or a backlash. Now, in retrospect, if I was to crank this thing way down, I want to show you what it'll do. This is just for demonstration. Did you see how many times that spool kept spinning afterwards? And now the line has come in and gone around the back side of the reel, creating a pinch point and a backlash. So for beginners, if you're throwing a light bait or heavy bait for that matter, the way to tune your reel to make sure that you're able to throw it accurately without getting a backlash every time is crank your reel brake on the side as tight as it can go, push your button, and slowly release. I'm gonna try to do this with my left hand here. Slowly release it, one click at a time, until it starts going And see, there's a backlash. So it needed to be pulled back just a little bit there. That was a good demonstration. That's what I was trying to do that first time. But we crank it up. You see it's not spooling. We click once, click twice. Now, you see I clicked it back and it stopped. We just open it up a little bit. The spool stopped. There is a little bit of line right there that has overspooled, but with you putting your finger on that spool, it will stop that much line. But as long as you can keep it from backlashing whenever the bait hits the ground on its own, like that, then you're gonna be in really, really good shape. One more demonstration, and then we're gonna move on to the next one. Let's see, tighten it up and loosen it up really slowly. There we go. Now, that looks like a backlash, but if I pull this out, there's no backlash there. That spool didn't move. I'm just using fluorocarbon line on this reel, and fluorocarbon has the ability and has the tendency sometimes to run off of the spool itself. But this reel is tuned in order to throw that bait a short distance as hard as I want to, and typically not backlash. Now, over time you'll practice, and whenever you practice, you will be able to throw this bait harder. You will be able to throw this bait farther, so cranking that brake down a little bit will allow you to cast a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further without getting a backlash. The last attribute of a reel, and this is one I don't typically mess with that often, is your side dial, which is a magnetic spool tension meter. That's what that does. It's magnetic and it creates tension on your spool. Now me, I crank this thing all the way up. That's the way I've always had it. That's the way it's always been. I don't typically mess with the settings on this one right here unless I'm just casting so much that I'm backlashing, or whenever I'm setting the hook, I'm getting an overrun or something along those lines. If I crank it all the way up, then I know that my spool is tense on the right or on the left-hand side, because this is a right-handed reel, and I can release and do most everything that I want to do with these two knobs. Again, the reel brake and the drag. So now back to the drag. We talked about that. We said we would tell you a little bit more about that. What I want to do is crank this drag down again as far as I can. I'll show you exactly how I like to set my reel. You can see this one here is to the point that I can barely pull and lines coming out. If I'm throwing a crankbait or a topwater that has treble hooks, I want my drag to be set to the point that I have a little bit of line on the hook set for give. And the reason that is because whenever I set the hook on a crankbait, I want just enough give, that way all three treble hooks can usually get in the fish's mouth. However, whenever I'm fishing a bait such as this with one solo hook, I want that drag to be set a little bit more tense. So whenever I set the hook, and this is perfect right here, you can see I'm having to pull pretty hard to get that line off. But whenever I set the hook on this bait, I want to be able to drive that hook in that fish's mouth with no give here at the spool. This is something that you're going to have to play with on the water whenever you set the hook, and too often in a boat your drag will loosen itself up, and every time it does, it's going to usually be on a jig or a worm where you want to rear down, set the hook hard, you don't want any give, and all of a sudden you set the hook and your line just unspools off of this reel. That is to be expected. This is a machine, and pieces of machine will break down over time. It is what it is. Don't worry, happens to the best of us. So, quick recap. Again, we've got the spool, we got the brake, the spool release, we got the brake, we've got the drag, and we've got the spool tension. Those are 4 things about a reel that you really need to know. The interior components are just as important, but I'm not going to go into them very, very deep, just because if I were to take this reel apart, there's a good chance I can never get it back together again. I've tried, and I'm just not mechanically inclined where a reel is concerned. So, the reason I did this video is because there's a young man by the name of Owen that requested it, and the question that he asked is, okay, number 1 is what kind of bait would you throw this time of year? Here's the thing, I am big on trying to match what the forage is of the fish. So if the fish are eating a crawdad, which is typical this time of year, I want the forage to match a crawdad, or my bait to match the crawdad. So this time of year, I want something that's going to wobble, something that has a red, brown, orangish tint, and even green for that matter, but something that's going to wobble and rattle. That's my thing. Now, it all depends, of course, on water clarity, because if you're in clear water, sometimes I'll go without a rattle, just because it's a little bit too much. If I'm in dingier water, I'll put the rattle on so the fish can identify the bait or identify a target based on sound and vibration and color. It's 3 different attributes that a fish can use to hone in on a bait. He also asked about line preference. It also depends highly on what type of bait I'm throwing and what kind of water clarity I'm in. If I'm in dingy water to muddy, I will up my line size to 17, 20, even 25 pound test. If I'm in clear water, then I'm usually between 12 and 15, depending. Or if I'm throwing a spinning rig, it's usually 8 or 10 pound test. The difference in fluorocarbon versus monofilament is, again, based on which bait I'm throwing. If I'm throwing a bait with a single hook, a jig, a worm, a spinnerbait, I want fluorocarbon because it doesn't have stretch, and whenever I set the hook, the line will snatch the bait and it will puncture and punch through the fish's mouth to ensure a good hook set. If I'm throwing something with treble hooks, I like using monofilament. That's just my personal preference, because whenever I set the hook on a fish, if I'm fishing monofilament, I want every minute of give I can have before those hooks puncture the fish's mouth, and monofilament stretches just a little bit. Because of its stretchability, whenever you set the hook on a fish with a crankbait, sometimes you'll have the stretch, you'll have the light tip of the rod, and you'll have a pause in your hook set all together, coupled with the drag setting, and it will give you just a split second longer for that fish to hold that bait in its mouth, and you get all of those hooks in that fish's mouth. So again, to be extremely vague, and I apologize for that, do what you're comfortable with, because I've talked about what I do. If you are a braid person, throw braid. If you are a fluorocarbon person, throw fluorocarbon. If you're a person that loves to crank your drag down to almost nothing, so whenever you set the hook, you get a big spool or a big pull on your spool, then do that. If you're a person that likes to crank that drag all the way down, then do it. What I employ from y'all, what I'm trying to convey here is do what makes you comfortable, but if it's not working or you find yourself failing, change things up a little bit. So I appreciate y'all tuning in. This is a quick rundown of what a reel is. I'm gonna get in here and start doing a lot more tackle prep, because my season starts this week. That's the beauty. Right now, y'all are catching me during my tackle prep, because on Saturday, after this video drops, I'll be fishing my first tournament of the year, the Anvil Jaw kickoff event on Lake Hamilton, followed by TBF, followed by Hogskin, followed by BFL, followed by Anvil Jaw again, I think, and so forth and so on. We have a lot of tournaments coming up here in the next month and a half, 2 months. So I appreciate y'all for following along. If you want to see me do another one of these videos where I tune in my spinning rig, just drop a comment. Let me know that you watched this video and that you want to see the spinning rig video, and I'll be happy to do that. I will talk about line selection, line preference, fluorocarbon to braid leader, my knot that I use, all that fun stuff. I don't have a problem sharing all that information with y'all. So I appreciate this. I hope it was educational, and like always, y'all keep chunking.